The earth remembers more than it tells. Every river stone smoothed by ancient hands, every charred fragment of hearth ash buried in soil, whispers of inventions older than cities, older than history itself. We imagine the Stone Age as a time of survival, of bare hands and crude tools, but what if it was also a time of quiet genius? What if, long before writing, before monuments, our ancestors were shaping ideas and technologies that would carry us across the ages? Hello there, and welcome to BoneAge. My name is Thomas. Tonight, let us walk into the dim glow of prehistory, where the air was filled with the scent of smoke and damp earth, where shadows stretched across cave walls, and where every flicker of firelight revealed not just survival, but invention. These were not ignorant beings fumbling in darkness. They were problem solvers, dreamers, and innovators whose discoveries still live inside us. Think of it, fire controlled not as an accident, but as a machine without wheels or gears, yet one that reshaped flesh, sharpened minds, and turned raw landscapes into places of belonging, or the first thread pulled from plant fiber, twisted and tied, carrying within it the unseen beginning of clothing, trade, and even identity. These are not stories of ignorance. They are stories of brilliance without record, of genius without monuments. Perhaps every cave was once a workshop, every fire circle a laboratory, every gathering of hands and voices a spark of imagination, and perhaps if you close your eyes, you can hear it still, the scrape of flint, the crackle of kindling, the faint notes of a bone flute drifting in the night air. This journey is not about what we already know, but about what might have been. The lost inventions of the Stone Age are fragments of a story larger than memory, scattered across time. Some we've uncovered in shards of bone and stone. Others may be gone forever, their presence only guessed at through the gaps in the record. But all remind us of the same haunting truth. Civilization was not our beginning. It was only a continuation of something far older. And to begin, we must return to the first light that humans ever shaped, the flame that became both machine and God. The first sparks were not inventions. They were accidents, lightning splitting an ancient tree, lava spilling from the belly of the earth, friction born from storms and falling stones. Yet one day, somewhere in the vastness of Africa, a hand reached toward that light, not to fear it, but to hold it. In that act, a machine was born, not metal, not stone, not carved wood, but a living engine of transformation, fire. Imagine the world before it, nights that were vast and absolute, broken only by the silver spill of moonlight. Predators moved in silence, their eyes catching faint glimmers in the dark. The air smelled of raw meat, of damp hides, of cold stone that never warmed. Into this world, fire arrived as something alien. To look into flame was to look into movement itself, always shifting, always consuming, yet never quite graspable. Archaeologists tell us that evidence of deliberate fire use reaches as far back as 400,000 years ago, though scattered hints push that number deeper, perhaps to 800,000 years. At first it was small, a patch of ash at a cave entrance, a cluster of burned bones, soil blackened where once a hearth had lived. But behind those fragments lies something revolutionary. For the first time, humans were no longer simply adapting to the world, they were reshaping it. Think of fire not as warmth, not as light, but as a technology that rewrote our biology. Raw meat, once torn apart by jaw strength and digestive acids, could now be transformed by heat. Proteins unfolded, fibers softened, parasites burned away. The calories that once took hours of chewing became suddenly more available, more concentrated. The body changed to meet this new gift. Our jaws shrank, our teeth grew smaller, our intestines shortened, and our brains, those hungry, energy-devouring organs, expanded. Cooking was not a luxury. It was fuel for the evolution of thought. Close your eyes and picture it, a circle of figures gathered around flame. Their faces glow in oranges and reds, shadows stretching across the cave wall like echoes of other lives. They are chewing roasted roots, sharing charred strips of animal flesh, passing warmth between them, not just through fire, but through story. For the first time in human history, the night is not an enemy. It is a place of gathering. This was the machine of machines, where the wheel would not come for tens of thousands of years, where writing lay far beyond the horizon. Fire already spun the gears of transformation. It hardened wooden spears, making them sharper and stronger. It baked clay into durable forms. It allowed plants toxic in their raw state to be eaten safely. It stretched the day into hours, where work could continue long after sunset. Fire was not just survival. It was leverage, multiplying every effort, amplifying every gesture of ingenuity. But what made it a true machine was its repeatability. An invention is not an accident. It is the ability to recreate, to master. Early humans discovered that flame could be coaxed into existence, perhaps at first by carrying embers from a lightning strike, nurturing them with dry grass and bark. Later, by striking stone against stone until sparks leapt forth, or by twisting a stick in friction until smoke curled upward like a promise. Each method was a blueprint. Each technique passed down was a manual written not in ink but in memory. Fire became the first technology that could be taught, repeated, spread, and with it came something else, control. To command fire was to bend the environment, to keep predators at bay with circles of flame, to clear landscapes by burning brush, guiding animals into easier hunts, to shape stone through heat, cracking it in ways bare hands never could. Imagine the realization that this living light could be tamed, that what once terrified could now obey. It was the dawn of mastery, and it changed everything that followed. The rhythm of life shifted around it. Days no longer ended with the sun. Night became an extension, a time to carve tools, to weave fibers, to sit close and learn. The fire pit became a center, a pulse around which human life revolved. You can almost hear it, the crackle of burning wood, the low murmur of voices, the occasional burst of laughter carried into the darkness beyond the cave. Fire was not merely useful, it was transformative. But machines demand care. They must be maintained, tended, respected. To keep fire alive through wind and rain was no small task. Embers were carried from place to place, wrapped in bark or dried fungus, glowing like hidden treasure. A family might guard its flame for years, never letting it die. And in that constant vigilance, fire shaped not just biology but culture. It taught patience, it taught responsibility, it gave rise to ritual. Even the smoke played its part. Rising from hearths, drifting into the night sky, it left behind traces in ancient caves, microscopic soot particles, blackened ceilings, records of gatherings long forgotten. To breathe in that smoke was to breathe in invention itself, the first true engine of change, and yet, beneath its warmth, there was always awe. To sit before fire was to sit before something alive, something both ally and danger. A machine, yes, but one that moved like a god. When a machine becomes more than a tool, when it inspires reverence as much as reliance, it crosses into something sacred. Fire, in its unpredictable dance, may have been the first invention to slip into the realm of worship. Imagine being one of the first to watch it leap from dry grass, flames twisting upward as if alive. The crackle is language, the light is movement, the warmth is embrace. It consumes but also gives. It can kill with smoke and heat, or it can cradle with comfort. For a people who had no words for science, no categories for physics or chemistry, how could this not be seen as divine? Dependence always breeds devotion. The small bands of early humans who learned to keep their flames burning may have treated them as members of the family, fed daily with sticks and branches, protected from rain and wind, watched over through the long nights. The fire pit was not just technology, it was kin. Its survival meant their survival. When embers dimmed, hearts must have quickened. When sparks rose, they may have whispered in relief. And here, speculation begins to weave with memory. Perhaps the first rituals were not carved in stone or painted on walls, but performed in silence around the glow of embers, a gesture of thanks as the fire caught, a muttered word, a shared glance upward, as though acknowledging something more than chance. For if the sun ruled the sky by day, fire was its fragment at night, an earthly piece of celestial power stolen and made small enough to touch. Across the world, scattered traces of early humanity hint at fire's elevation beyond utility. Archaeologists uncover hearths carefully arranged, stones placed not merely to contain flames but to frame them, almost like altars. Charcoal fragments suggest deliberate burning not just for food but for ceremony. The care itself speaks of reverence. Why else protect the flames so carefully, carrying embers wrapped in fungus and bark across long migrations, if not to guard something sacred? Perhaps you can picture it, the fire circle glowing in the heart of darkness, each figure leaning closer, faces painted with shadow and light. Around them, the world is vast and unknown. Predators move beyond the reach of vision. The wind howls through trees. Yet within this ring of flame there is safety, warmth, and something more, an illusion of control over forces too immense to understand. To sit by fire was to believe, if only for a moment, that chaos could be tamed. In this way, fire may have been the first god humanity ever served. Not a god of abstract heavens, but one that lived within reach, one that demanded offerings, branches, bark, resin, fat. To neglect it was to lose its blessing. To feed it was to be rewarded with heat and light. This reciprocal relationship echoes the essence of religion. Give, and you shall receive. And so stories may have been born. Flickering shadows on cave walls might have become spirits in the flame. The crackle and hiss of burning wood might have been voices whispering through the smoke. Each spark rising upward could have been seen as a messenger carrying prayers into the sky. Fire was not just an invention, it was an oracle, unpredictable yet necessary. Dependence also carries fear. The same flame that cooked food could consume entire forests. Lightning-born fires sweeping across grasslands would have been both spectacle and terror, a reminder that the gift could just as easily turn to punishment. To approach fire was to acknowledge risk, skin blistered, smoke choked, embers scarred. Its danger gave it authority. What humans feared, they also revered. Think of how later cultures would echo this primal reverence. Myths of fire stolen from the gods, of eternal flames tended in temples, of fire as purifier, destroyer, and bringer of life. These stories may be echoes of something far older, memories of nameless ancestors who first gathered around embers and whispered awe into the night. Perhaps the very act of tending flame was itself a form of prayer. Each addition of wood an offering, each blowing of embers a plea for life to continue. Maybe hands lifted towards sparks believed they touched something eternal. Maybe children were told not to play with fire, not only because of danger, but because it was sacred, a spirit not to be mocked. The soot on cave ceilings, black as memory, becomes more than archaeology. It becomes scripture written in smoke. Each hearth a shrine, each flame a sermon, each spark a reminder of forces both within reach and beyond comprehension, and in that glow the line between invention and religion blurred. Fire was the first machine, yes, but also the first god. It lived among humans, not in the sky or distant seas, but right there at the center of their lives, pulsing, breathing, demanding, giving. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. You are there, seated on cool earth, the smell of burning pine rising around you. The flames sway like dancers, unpredictable and mesmerizing. The heat touches your skin as though alive. Around you, silence holds the world beyond, but within this circle you feel watched, accompanied, sustained. You cannot name it, but you feel it, that the flame is more than fire, it is presence. And perhaps this is where religion began, not with gods carved in stone, not with temples built of pillars, but with firelight flickering across faces, a machine that became a spirit that became the first god humanity ever knew. Long before threads were spun into fabric, long before looms clattered in villages, there was a single discovery that changed the reach of humanity forever. It was not carved from stone or sparked into flame, but pulled from the bodies of animals and the fibers of plants. It was clothing. Picture the ancient world without it. Skin exposed to icy winds, to burning sun, to stinging insects, the body vulnerable in every season, forced to retreat when the climate shifted too far. Then imagine the first hide pulled over shoulders, still warm from the hunt. The air suddenly dulled against the skin. Cold winds turned aside. What was once unbearable became survivable. In that moment, humans were no longer confined by their own biology. They had created an artificial skin, an invention as simple as it was world-changing. The earliest evidence we have of clothing stretches back at least 170,000 years, though the true origin may be far older. Archaeologists trace hints not through preserved fabrics, which almost never survive, but through indirect clues, scraping tools bearing microscopic wear from hide preparation, bone awls polished smooth by repeated piercing, and the DNA of lice that adapted to live in fabric rather than on skin. These fragments together whisper the same truth. Clothing emerged not as decoration, but as survival. Think about what this meant. Without fire, humans could not tame the night. Without clothing, they could not tame the cold. Wrapped in furs and hides, they crossed landscapes no other primate could endure. The freezing steppes of Ice Age Europe, the windswept plains of Central Asia, the glaciers that advanced and retreated like living walls of ice. Everywhere the climate shifted, clothing became the portable technology that allowed migration, a shield that traveled with the body. Perhaps the earliest garments were crude, simple hides draped over the shoulders, tied with strips of sinew, stiff and heavy but effective over time. Skill grew. Scraping tools softened skins. Fat and smoke preserved them. Fibers were twisted into cords, laces, ties. Slowly hides became cloaks, cloaks became tailored coverings, and the human body became not just protected, but transformed. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the first migration into a frozen valley. The wind cuts like a blade. The air tastes of snow and stone. The tribe moves forward, their breath rising in clouds, their bodies wrapped in thick hides of reindeer and bison. Each step is a defiance of nature's limits. Without clothing, they would fall within hours. With it, they endure. With it, they claim new worlds. And this invention was not only about warmth, it was mobility. It was freedom. The body, once trapped by environment, now carried its own shelter. Each garment was a boundary between human and climate, a barrier that made every new land a possibility. This was not just adaptation. This was expansion. But there's something else hidden in this invention. Clothing was not only physical, it was cultural. The hides chosen, the way they were cut, the adornments added from beads, shells, and pigments all spoke of identity. Even in its earliest form, clothing was both tool and symbol. It carried memory, status, belonging. A hunter's cloak might hold the story of the animal it came from. A child's wrap might be lined with softer furs, showing care and protection. Every garment was survival, but also meaning. Speculate for a moment. What if clothing was the first art that moved with the body? Unlike paintings fixed to cave walls, unlike carvings left behind, clothing traveled across landscapes, turning every person into a canvas. Perhaps the first symbols were not scratched into stone but stitched into hide. Perhaps the first colors were not painted on walls but painted on skin and fabric. Clothing blurred the line between necessity and expression. And there is another layer still. With clothing came the possibility of concealment, of ritual, of transformation. Animal skins worn not just for warmth but for ceremony. Disguises that turned the hunter into the hunted, the human into the spirit of the beast. In these acts, clothing transcended survival. It became a doorway into imagination. Think of it. Fire allowed humans to stay in one place longer. Clothing allowed them to leave, to push into places where no other primate could follow. Each new land entered, each step into ice and snow, was a triumph not of muscle, but of invention. This was not evolution alone, it was technology guiding biology, and so the invention of clothing stands not as a minor detail, but as one of the most profound revolutions in human history. It reshaped migration, it expanded culture, it allowed humans to become, for the first time, a truly global species. And yet there is more, for clothing, though simple, opened the path to something even greater, an invention so small it could fit in the palm of the hand, yet so powerful it stitched together the fabric of survival itself. The needle. The needle is so small, so easily overlooked, and yet without it entire migrations would have been impossible. When archaeologists sift through ancient soils and caves, they sometimes find them, tiny fragments of bone shaped to a point, with a hole drilled through. At first glance they appear fragile, almost delicate, but their impact was immense. With these tools, humanity learned not just to wrap itself in hides, but to shape them, to stitch them, to transform rough coverings into garments fitted for the body. Imagine the difference. A heavy pelt draped over the shoulders keeps the cold away for a time, but it's clumsy, it slips, it exposes the skin. A stitched tunic, by contrast, moves with you, sealing warmth, freeing your hands, allowing you to travel farther and endure longer. The leap is not in material, but in method, and the method was genius. Some of the oldest known needles date back more than 50,000 years, crafted from bird bones and mammoth ivory. Their survival in the record is rare, for bone is fragile, yet their presence suggests an innovation that may have spread much earlier. Think of the skill required, grinding a bone to a fine point, piercing it carefully to create an eye, and then using sinew, gut, or plant fiber as thread. To invent the needle was to invent precision. It was to create a tool not for breaking or striking, but for weaving, binding, connecting. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the scene, a figure seated near the fire, the glow falling across careful Teoret's hands. A strip of hide lies across their lap. The needle pierces, pulls thread, pierces again, drawing two edges together until a seam forms. Around them the night is cold, but within their hands warmth is being secured for days to come. This is survival turned into craft. But perhaps it was more than craft. Perhaps every stitch was also a story. The act of sewing transformed not only hides, but the very idea of what clothing could be. With a needle, garments could be shaped to the body, adorned with beads, dyed with ochre, fringed with meaning. A cloak could mark status. A child's tunic could carry symbols of protection. The needle made clothing not just a barrier against cold, but an expression of identity. And so, the invention of sewing may have been the quiet birth of culture as wearable art. Think of how later traditions across the world carried forward this impulse. Patterns woven into cloth, embroidery telling stories, garments marking tribes, ceremonies, and status. Perhaps all of this began with those first tiny needles of bone. Speculate for a moment. What if sewing was as revolutionary as fire? One allowed us to master the elements of heat and light, the other to master the elements of cold and distance. Without needles, migrations into the frozen north of Eurasia, into the high plateaus of Siberia, even into the crossing toward the Americas, might never have been possible. Warmth carried not only in firelight, but in stitched hides wrapped close to the skin. The thread was not just material, it was a lifeline, and yet how easily such inventions vanish. Wooden needles, plant fiber threads, sinew ties, all decay with time, leaving behind only faint whispers in the soil. We may never know how many innovations were born in the hands of ancestors whose names we cannot speak, whose tools have turned to dust. But the survival of bone needles is enough to tell us this. Humans were not merely surviving, they were engineering their survival with precision tools as elegant as anything we know today. There's another image to hold in your mind. A group gathers as winter closes in, snow pressed against the mouth of their shelter. Inside, garments are being repaired, seams tightened, patches added. The sound is not loud. It is the soft rhythm of thread pulled through hide, of quiet conversation, of warmth held not only by fire, but by the garments crafted through shared labor. Each stitch binds not only clothing but community. To sew was to care, to prepare, to think of tomorrow. From this culture was born, for clothing was never only about warmth, it became about belonging. The patterns of stitching, the choice of materials, the adornments tied into seams, all became signals of who you were and where you came from. What began as survival became identity, and identity, once expressed, shaped the bonds between groups, the recognition of self and other. The needle was not only a tool of protection, it was a tool of connection, and maybe there was something spiritual in it too. The act of piercing hide, of drawing thread through, of binding two edges into one. Was it only practical, or did it echo something deeper? Perhaps sewing became a metaphor before words existed for it. To stitch was to mend, to heal, to bring together what was once separate. Perhaps in those first quiet nights of sewing, humans glimpsed the idea that life itself was something that could be bound together, repaired, made whole. In this way, the needle was more than an unsung invention. It was the thread that wove survival into culture, that stitched necessity into meaning, that carried us across continents and into futures unimaginable. Fire gave us light. The needle gave us form. Together, they built the foundations of humanity. Out in the open, under vast ice age skies, the body was always exposed. Winds carved across the plains, rain hammered to the earth, snow buried the ground in silence. Predators moved in the dark, their eyes catching faint glimmers of firelight. To survive was to endure these elements unshielded, until one of the greatest inventions in human history began to take shape: the shelter. At first nature provided what it could: rock overhangs, caves carved by rivers, hollow spaces between boulders. These were havens of chance, found rather than made. Imagine stepping into a cave during a storm. The walls, cool and rough beneath your hands, the outside world howling just beyond the entrance. The difference between exposure and protection was immediate, visceral. The cave was not only stone, it was survival. But soon humanity reached for something more. The leap was subtle yet profound, from finding shelter to building it. Wooden branches leaned against one another, skins stretched and tied, stones piled into walls. With each experiment, humans began to shape not only tools and clothing, but space itself. The world no longer dictated where they could rest. They began to carve out pockets of safety with their own hands. Some of the earliest evidence of constructed shelters comes from places like Terra Amata in southern France, where archaeologists uncovered traces of huts dating back nearly 400,000 years. Wooden posts arranged in circles, ash from central hearths, stones laid as supports. These were not mere windbreaks, they were homes. For the first time humans had created a space that was theirs, apart from the wilderness beyond. Close your eyes for a moment and picture one: a frame of branches bent and tied, covered with animal hides stretched taut. Inside, the floor is lined with grasses. At the center, fire flickers, smoke drifting upward through a vent. The walls muffle the wind. Outside, the night belongs to wolves and ice. Inside, there's warmth, light, and something new: privacy. Over time, shelters grew in sophistication. In the frozen plains of what is now Ukraine and Russia, archaeologists have uncovered remnants of structures built not from wood alone, but from the very bones of mammoths. Tusks arched into doorways, ribs stacked into walls, hides stretched across skeletal frames. These were not crude improvisations. They were feats of engineering. Imagine the sight of a dwelling larger than any cave, its walls gleaming pale with ivory, its interior warmed by fire, its construction a collaboration of many hands. Such houses were monuments to survival, proof that humans could bend even the remains of giants into instruments of endurance. The importance of these shelters cannot be overstated. They were more than protection. They were continuity. A shelter could be repaired, expanded, returned to season after season. They became landmarks of memory, places where children were born, where stories were told, where tools were fashioned in the glow of firelight. To step inside was to enter not only safety but belonging, and perhaps here again culture was seeded. The boundaries of walls created the boundaries of family. Within them space was organized, areas for sleeping, for working, for cooking. The act of dividing space may have been the first step toward the idea of community. Shelters turned groups of wanderers into households, households into tribes, and tribes into societies. Speculate for a moment. What did it feel like to invent the concept of home? To walk through the door of something built by human hands? To feel the difference between the chaos outside and the order within? Perhaps the first sensation was relief, but soon it may have been pride. These walls did not come from chance, they came from thought, from intention, from invention. The first shelters were not just places to sleep. They were symbols of control over a world that had once seemed untamable. Shelter also changed time itself. Without protection, humans were at the mercy of seasons, forced to migrate or perish. With shelters, they could linger, endure storms, plan ahead. A hut was not just a covering, it was a pause button, a way to resist the relentless push of climate and hunger. To build a shelter was to claim a piece of permanence in a fleeting world. The archaeological record reveals more than bones and stones. It reveals the shadows of imagination. At sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, evidence of complex settlements emerges. Mammoth bone dwellings, arranged in patterns, hearths aligned, storage pits dug nearby. These were not random constructions. They were villages in embryo, communities bound together by shared walls and shared fires. And here lies the deeper significance. Shelters did not merely protect humans from the outside. They shaped what happened inside. They created space for conversation, for teaching, for art. The first carvings and ornaments may have been fashioned in these enclosed spaces, away from the constant watch of predators. The first songs may have been sung beneath roofs of hide, voices echoing softly against bone and wood. In this way, shelters became the first theaters of culture. Now let us step closer. Imagine entering one of these mammoth bone houses. The tusks arch overhead like ribs of a cathedral. The fire crackles at the center, throwing light against the pale walls. Tools hang from sinew cords, hides dry along the frame, and beads carved from ivory lie scattered on the floor. Outside, snow swirls in endless silence. Inside, life continues. Warmth, story, invention. Perhaps this was the first architecture. Not in the sense of monuments or temples, but in the act of shaping space deliberately. Every shelter was a blueprint, a hint of what would one day become cities. Each post driven into the earth, each height stretched into a wall, was a step toward the idea that humans could not only inhabit the world, but build their own within it. The leap from cave to hut, from overhang to house, was one of the greatest revolutions in human history. It transformed survival into stability, and stability into imagination. For once there were walls, there was also the idea of what could be placed within them. Shelters were the silent foundations of civilization, born not of stone towers or palaces, but of small circles of branches and bone glowing softly against the dark. Before there were walls of stone rising into the sky, before columns and arches, before names like Babylon, Ur, or Rome, there were huts pressed into earth and framed by wood. Simple, fragile, temporary, and yet, within their design, lay the seeds of architecture. Architecture is more than shelter. It is space made deliberate, space arranged with thought, with rhythm, with meaning. And though we look back at mammoth bone houses and domed huts as primitive, they may have carried the same essence as the temples and cities that followed. Every pole driven into the ground, every hide stretched over a frame, was a line drawn between chaos and order. Every hearth at the center was not only heat, it was axis, orientation, the point around which life revolved. Imagine for a moment one of those early structures. The walls curve inward, enclosing light and warmth. There is an entrance, a threshold, a place where the outside ends and the inside begins. Already, the human mind has divided the world, shaping space into layers of meaning. Here is danger, there is safety, here is wilderness, there is home. This is the beginning of architecture, and architecture carries memory. The child born within such walls learns that space can be shaped, that boundaries can be drawn, that protection can be made rather than found. They grow with this knowledge, and when they build their own shelter, they carry the same patterns forward. What we call culture may in part be architecture passed from one generation to the next, a blueprint encoded not in writing but in practice. Some archaeologists argue that the symmetry seen in certain early dwellings, the careful arrangement of hearths, the repeated use of circular or oval forms, suggests an emerging aesthetic sense, not just practicality. Could it be that even then humans felt the pull of proportion, the quiet satisfaction of symmetry? If so, these were the first architects, their work measured not in stone blocks, but in bent branches and tied hides. Speculate further. Perhaps every hut was more than shelter. Perhaps it was a model of the universe as they saw it. The walls, the horizon, the roof, the sky, the fire, the sun at the center. Within that small circle, life had order, meaning, connection. In this way, architecture began not as construction, but as cosmology, an attempt to recreate the world in miniature, to give form to existence itself. And from such beginnings, the path to cities becomes less mysterious. For what is a city but a shelter multiplied? A house beside a house, a fire beside a fire, walls extended outward until they enclose thousands. The instinct to build, to shape space, was already alive in the first hut. The cathedral is only the echo of the mammoth bone house, magnified by time. Close your eyes and imagine a winter evening 25,000 years ago. The snow falls outside, thick and endless. Within the shelter, firelight paints the walls. Tools hang in place. The floor is swept and ordered. This is not chaos. This is design. And in that design is something deeply human. The urge not only to survive, but to arrange, to beautify, to give form. The smallest hut may have carried the same spirit that would one day raise pyramids. Even the act of placing a hearth in the center, repeated across millennia, foreshadows the plazas and squares of future cities. The communal space, the gathering point, the center of orientation, all born in firelit huts on frozen plains. These were not accidents. They were patterns of thought, repeated until they became tradition, tradition until they became architecture. Perhaps the most haunting idea is this, that every city in history rests upon invisible foundations of huts and hearths. The skyscraper in its glass and steel carries the ghost of bent branches tied with sinew. The palace carries the echo of mammoth bones stacked in circles. The blueprint was drawn long before the materials changed. And in this sense, architecture did not begin with civilization. Civilization began with architecture. So when we think of shelters as primitive, we overlook their genius. They were not only walls against weather. They were experiments in space, in community, in meaning. Each hut was a cathedral in embryo, each circle of posts a prophecy of the cities yet to come. To move across land was one thing, to cross water was another. Rivers, lakes, seas, these were barriers as ancient as the world itself, shifting boundaries that divided human from horizon. For countless animals, the line of the shore was an ending. For humans, it became a beginning. The first boats were not carved with elegance or precision. They were not sleek vessels gliding across oceans, but rafts of reeds bound together, logs lashed with vines, dug-out trunks, hollowed by fire and stone. And yet, in their crude forms, they carried something immense, the possibility of leaving the known behind. Archaeological evidence whispers of journeys astonishingly old. More than 50,000 years ago, humans reached Australia, a continent separated from Asia by vast stretches of sea. This was no accidental drift. It required planning, preparation, and courage beyond measure. Imagine it, groups of early humans gathering at the edge of a shoreline, looking out over waters that stretched further than sight. Behind them, familiar lands of forest and savanna. Before them, a horizon unknown. Between them, waves that could swallow without mercy. And still they set out. Close your eyes and picture the scene. A raft of logs bound with sinew and fiber. Fires used to hollow wood. Tools chipping edges smooth. The air smells of salt and smoke. The tide pulls outward. The group pushes, the vessel lurches, and for the first time in history, humans leave the land behind, carried by an invention unlike any before, a vehicle that floats. Boats were more than transport. They were liberation. To step into one was to step beyond the constraints of geography. Rivers no longer trapped, islands no longer isolated, oceans no longer impossible. Each journey was a rewriting of boundaries, a declaration that the world was not closed but open. And with these vessels came expansion. The crossing to Australia stands as one of the earliest and boldest examples. But smaller journeys must have come first, across rivers swollen with rain, lakes dotted with islands, coastlines curving into coves. Each success built confidence, knowledge, tradition. Each failure taught lessons remembered by the survivors. Slowly, water became not barrier, but pathway. Consider what this invention required. To lash logs together is not instinct. To hollow a trunk with fire, controlling the burn without splitting the wood, demands patience and technique. To bind reeds so tightly that they resist waterlogging requires experimentation, trial, error, and to step into such a craft requires faith, not only in the vessel, but in one another. Boats were collective inventions, born of hands working together, sustained by trust. Perhaps the most remarkable element is not their construction, but their purpose. Fire gave warmth, clothing gave protection, shelters gave permanence, but boats gave something less tangible, exploration. They were the first machines not for survival alone, but for discovery. With a boat, one could leave not because one must, but because one could. The horizon became invitation, not limit. Speculate for a moment. How did those early navigators imagine the unknown? Did they believe other lands waited across the water, or did they step into the waves with only hope? Perhaps myths were born in these crossings, the idea of islands inhabited by spirits, of seas that carried messages to gods. Every oar stroke may have been a prayer, every horizon line a promise. Boats also carried more than people. They carried culture. Fire could be transported, clothing worn, tools held. But boats allowed the movement of entire communities, entire ways of life. With them came new exchanges, shells carried inland, obsidian carried outward, songs and stories drifting between shores. The first networks of trade and contact may have floated on reeds and logs, long before the invention of the wheel. And in this lies the deeper truth. Boats were not only vehicles of movement, they were vehicles of imagination. To cross water is to accept uncertainty, to embrace mystery. It is to leave the known behind in search of the unseen. That leap, physical, mental, spiritual, was perhaps as great as the leap from cave to hut, from fire to God. Think of the silence on such a crossing, the steady creak of wood, the rhythm of paddles striking water, the endless horizon merging sky and sea. Behind, the fading line of home. Ahead, nothing but hope. In those moments, invention and faith became inseparable. The boat was both tool and prayer, machine and metaphor. So we can say, the first boats were not only inventions of wood and fiber, they were the first machines of exploration, the first vessels of human imagination, carrying us beyond the edge of what was known into the uncharted spaces of the world. Once the first boats had been built, the world itself seemed to expand. Rivers were no longer borders. Coastlines were no longer edges. The horizon was no longer a boundary, but a question. And the ones who dared to answer it, the navigators of the Stone Age, became the world's first explorers. What makes their journeys so haunting is what they lacked. No compass to guide direction, no maps etched on parchment, no stars charted on paper. Their only tools were memory, instinct, and courage. Imagine it. A raft of reeds sliding into open water, the paddles dipping, the shoreline shrinking, the horizon stretching vast and uncertain. Every decision rested on the body's senses, watching the sun's arc across the sky, feeling the pull of currents, listening to the cries of birds overhead. It is easy to forget how sharp those senses once were. Modern life dulls them, but for ancient navigators, they were everything. They could read the wind by its taste on the tongue, predict weather from the shapes of clouds, sense direction from the swell of waves. Every ripple on the water was information, every shadow on the horizon a possibility. Their world was a living map, written not in ink, but in motion, sound, and light. Speculate for a moment on the crossing to Australia more than 50,000 years ago. A journey not of hours, but of days, perhaps weeks. The sea is wide, the destination unseen. And yet they arrived. They brought with them fire, tools, songs, and culture. They carried not only survival, but belief, the belief that beyond the horizon lay land worth reaching. Was it vision? Was it desperation? Was it courage alone? Whatever the reason, it was enough to move entire communities across oceans. Close your eyes and imagine sitting in such a vessel. The air is heavy with salt. The water slaps against wood. Stars emerge overhead, brighter than you have ever seen. The Milky Way spilling across the sky like a river of light. There is no compass, but the stars themselves guide you, their patterns learned and passed down through generations. A child points to one cluster, repeating words taught by elders. That one leads home. Navigation is not calculation, it is memory and story. This blending of story and survival may have been the first form of maritime tradition. Songs that marked the rhythm of paddles, myths that explained the constellations, tales told to children of islands waiting beyond the sea, of ancestors who once crossed and returned. In these ways, navigation was not separate from culture, it was culture. To sail was to believe, to remember, to carry forward the knowledge of those who dared before. And perhaps here we glimpse the beginning of exploration as a human instinct, to walk into new valleys, to climb mountains, to cross rivers. These were small steps, but to step into the ocean, where no land was visible, was something greater. It was to move into true uncertainty, guided only by the conviction that discovery was possible. This courage is what defines exploration. It is not merely travel, it is trust in the unseen. The archaeologist's evidence is faint but undeniable. Stone tools found in places they should not be. Genetic traces linking populations across waters. Shell ornaments carried far inland. Proof of networks that must have crossed seas. Even in the Pacific, evidence suggests journeys to remote islands, tens of thousands of years before written history. Each discovery is a fragment of a map we are only beginning to reconstruct. A map drawn not by ink but by courage. Think of the legacy of those early sailors. Without them, vast continents would have remained untouched. Populations would have remained isolated. Cultures would have grown smaller, narrower, confined. It was the navigator's instinct, the willingness to leave shore without a guarantee, that wove humanity into a global species. Every migration, every expansion, every cultural exchange carries the imprint of those first voyages. Perhaps the most profound truth is this: the courage of the Stone Age navigator is not so different from the courage of the astronaut. Both step into vessels fragile against the vastness around them. Both rely on tools made by human hands, knowledge passed down, stories told. Both move into silence and darkness, guided by faith in what lies beyond. The sea was the first cosmos, the boat was the first spacecraft, and the navigators of the Stone Age were the first explorers of the infinite. Now picture the return: a raft sliding back to shore, laden with shells, with food, with stories of another place. The tribe gathers, listening as voices describe lands across the water, new animals, new plants, new skies. In that moment, exploration becomes memory, memory becomes story, and story becomes legacy. Each voyage expands not only geography, but imagination. The world grows not in size, but in possibility. And so, these early sailors remind us of something essential. Exploration is not an invention of civilization. It is older, deeper, woven into us since the first paddles struck water. No maps, no compasses, no written records. Only courage, memory, and the pull of the horizon. They were the navigators of the unknown, and through them the world itself became open. When the journeys ended and the boats were pulled to shore, when the hunts were done and the fires burned low, there was still another invention waiting in the silence. Not a tool of stone, not a weapon of bone, but something invisible, carried in breath and rhythm. Music. Picture a cave deep in Europe nearly 40,000 years ago. The walls are painted with ochre and charcoal, the air heavy with smoke. At the center, someone lifts a hollow bone to their lips. They breathe, and the sound that emerges is not mere noise. It is structured, it is haunting, it is deliberate. A flute carved from the wing bone of a vulture, finger holes set with careful precision, producing notes that echo against the stone. It is the oldest instrument we know, and it tells us something extraordinary. These people were not content only to survive. They sought to create beauty, to bind themselves with sound. Flutes were not alone. Drums stretched with hide, rattles filled with pebbles, sticks struck against stone, all became part of a rhythm that pulsed through the darkness. Music turned gatherings into ceremonies, work into ritual, silence into shared experience. Where words failed, rhythm carried meaning. Where speech ended, melody began. Imagine it, a group seated close to the fire, the flames casting shadows like moving spirits on the wall. The drum begins, steady and low. A rattle joins, the sound like falling rain. Then the flute rises, weaving melody above the rhythm. Voices join, chanting, singing, calling out into the cave. The stone walls amplify the sound, turning the chamber into a vast instrument. For those present, it is not just performance, it is transformation. Music was more than art. It was glue. It bound tribes together, synchronized movement, unified emotion. In hunting, rhythm organized steps and shouts. In ritual, song aligned breath and thought. In grief, melody carried sorrow. In joy, it multiplied celebration. The tribe did not need writing when it had rhythm. Knowledge, emotion, and memory traveled together in sound. Archaeologists uncover fragments of flutes, beats that may have rattled, drums suggested by wear patterns on bone. But what they cannot uncover are the songs themselves. Those are lost, vanished into time. And yet perhaps they still echo faintly in us, the way a heartbeat quickens with rhythm, the way a melody lingers after silence. These instincts are not modern, they are ancient, carved into us across generations of singers and listeners. Speculate for a moment. Perhaps the caves themselves were chosen not only for their protection, but for their acoustics. Some chambers amplify sound, creating natural resonance, echoing every note into something larger than itself. Imagine the awe of early humans, hearing their voices multiplied by stone, as though the earth itself were singing back. Could this be why music and ritual so often intertwined? The cave was not only shelter, it was stage, cathedral, amplifier. Close your eyes and hear it. The drum's pulse steady as a heartbeat, the flute's melody floating like smoke, voices rising and falling like waves. This is more than survival. This is connection. This is culture. And so, music in the caves was not a distraction from survival. It was survival of another kind. The survival of memory, of community, of identity. In those echoes, humanity began to find its voice, a voice not bound to words alone, but to sound itself. In the stillness of those ancient nights, sound was not only an expression, it was preservation. Long before writing etched symbols into clay or ink-stained parchment, songs carried the weight of memory. They were the first archives, woven not into paper but into breath, vibration, and rhythm. Think of the difference between words spoken once and words sung many times. A story told in plain voice can scatter like dust on the wind, but a story set to rhythm lingers, repeating itself until it is etched into the body as much as the mind. The beat of a drum, the rise and fall of melody, these patterns locked knowledge into form. Songs became the earliest technology of memory. Imagine a child learning the movements of the hunt, not from diagrams but from chant. Each animal given a rhythm, each path a verse, each danger a warning sung into memory, or picture a tribe recounting its ancestry. Names repeated in chorus, their voices rising with the fire. In this way, the past was not forgotten, it was sung forward. Speculate for a moment. Perhaps every cave painting we now study in silence once had a song that accompanied it. Perhaps the figures of bison and horses, painted in ochre and charcoal, were not just images, but verses remembered, melodies rising in echo as the pictures came to life in firelight. What if those walls were never meant to be seen in silence, but to resound with music? Archaeologists have uncovered flutes, drums, and rattles, but the songs themselves remain lost. And yet, we feel their shadow in us, the way a heartbeat matches rhythm, the way a melody lingers long after it ends. These instincts are not inventions of modernity, they are inheritances. Every time we hum a tune, we repeat what our ancestors once did to keep memory alive. Music was also technology of emotion. It shaped not only what was remembered, but how it was remembered. Joy carried on high, quick rhythms. Grief held in slow, low tones. Awe stretched into long echoes that filled the dark. In this way, music preserved more than information. It preserved feeling. The past was not simply recalled. It was relived, carried in the sound of memory. Close your eyes for a moment and hear it. A funeral song rising in the cave, voices low and steady, the drum pulsing like a heartbeat. Each tone holds grief but also remembrance. The one who is gone is not forgotten, because their name, their story, their presence has been carried into sound. The song is more than ritual. It is technology of the soul, ensuring that memory does not fade. Perhaps this is why music endures across every culture, every era. Even when languages differ, songs can be shared. They cross boundaries that words cannot. They are both fragile and eternal, disappearing the moment they are sung, yet remembered long after silence returns. In this paradox, music becomes the most human of inventions, a thing that cannot be held, yet holds us together. Speculate further. Could it be that song was the bridge to language itself? That rhythm and melody trained the brain to hold complex sequences, to link sound with meaning, to build patterns that would one day become words. If so, then every spoken sentence is not separate from music, but its descendant. Our voices, even now, are echoes of ancient song, and so music was not only art, it was archive, ritual, memory, identity. The sound of memory carried through caves and across landscapes, binding generations, preserving what no stone could hold. When we listen to music today, we are not just entertained, we are reaching back into the oldest invention of the mind, the technology of emotion that made us human. If music was the sound of memory, then art was its image, where song carried the voice of the past through rhythm, paint and carving, carried thought into the silence of stone. In caves, on bones, across the faces of cliffs, humans began to leave marks that would outlive them, marks that were not accidents of survival, but deliberate signs, symbols, a new language taking shape. Imagine stepping into the painted caves of Chauvet or Lascaux. The air is cool, damp with the weight of centuries. Torchlight flickers across walls, alive with movement, horses galloping, bison charging, lions stalking. These were not casual sketches. They were visions pulled from life and placed into permanence. Ochre and charcoal pressed into stone, lines curved with precision, colors shaded with depth. In these paintings, the hunt is not only remembered, it is eternal. But it was not only animals that filled the walls. Hands appeared too, stencils made by blowing pigment around fingers pressed against rock. To see them is to stand face to face with someone who lived tens of thousands of years ago, their presence fixed in outline. These are not tools, they are declarations. I was here, we were here. The human impulse to leave a trace had found its first true canvas. Carvings tell a similar story. Bones incised with patterns, stones etched with lines, ivory shaped into figurines. Some may have carried meaning we cannot decipher, marks of identity, of clan, of ritual. Others, like the Venus figurines, suggest reverence for fertility, for life itself. Whatever their purpose, they reveal something profound. Humans had begun to think in symbols, to represent more than what was immediately present. This was the birth of abstraction. A line was no longer only a line. It could be a horse, a hand, a spirit, a memory. Through art, the mind leapt from the tangible to the symbolic, from what was to what could be imagined, and in that leap, communication expanded. The painted wall became a message board across the time. One generation left images for the next, binding past and future in pigment and stone. Speculate for a moment. Perhaps every painting was not only record but ritual. Perhaps the act of painting summoned the hunt before it began, calling animals into presence. Perhaps hand stencils were more than signatures. They were prayers, gestures of belonging, reminders that the body itself was part of the world painted onto stone. What if art was not ornament at all, but magic, the first attempt to make thought visible, to give form to the unseen? Close your eyes and picture the moment of creation. A torch sputters, a figure leans close to the wall, pigment ground in stone bowls at their feet. They dip a brush of hair or moss into ochre, press it against the rock, and a line appears. It is not the first line they have made, but each one carries meaning. Around them, others watch, their faces glowing with firelight. The wall begins to fill, not only with image, but with story. This is not a hunt. It is the memory of a hunt, the dream of another, the teaching of what is to come. Symbols are language before language. They allow thought to leap from one mind to another across time and distance. A painted bison is not only a bison, it is food, danger, community, survival. A carved line repeated in sequence may not only be decoration, it may be a count of days, of hunts, of seasons. In this way, art was more than beauty. It was information, preserved in a form that could endure long after voices fell silent. And yet, it was also imagination. Where music carried emotion, art carried vision. It invited humans to see not only what was, but what might be. A horse drawn with 8 legs in motion captured speed beyond what the eye could hold. A half-human, half-animal figure hinted at myths, at beings that existed only in thought. In these images, the human mind stretched beyond the limits of the present, inventing futures, gods, and worlds unseen. Perhaps this is why art moves us still. To stand before a cave painting is to feel the spark of that first leap into symbolism. The pigments may be ancient, the lines weathered, but the message remains. A hand on stone, an animal in motion, a figure imagined, each one says the same thing. We thought, we dreamed, we remembered. Art was not an accessory to survival. It was survival of another kind, the survival of meaning. It was the first language written not with words, but with symbols. A language that carried across time and space, from one firelit gathering to another, from one generation to the next. And in this way, art became the bridge between memory and imagination, between the world as it was and the world as it could be. To paint an animal on a wall is to remember it, but to paint a creature that never existed, part human, part beast, is to invent, and that invention, born not from need but from thought, may be the first spark of imagination. In those dark chambers, firelight flickering across stone, early humans did something no other creature had done before. They created images not only of what they saw, but of what they could not see. They reached into the unseen, into the possible, and gave it form. This was more than survival. This was the birth of imagination. Consider the Lion Man figurine found in Germany, carved from mammoth ivory more than 30,000 years ago. A human body with the head of a lion. No such creature ever walked the earth. And yet someone sat and shaped it, spending hours, perhaps days, bringing it into being. What purpose did it serve? A spirit? A god? A story told through form? We may never know. But what we do know is this. The mind that carved it was not bound to the present. It could envision beyond. Speculate for a moment. Perhaps the first myths were born here, in this leap from real to imagined. A bison drawn with extra legs to show speed. A half-animal figure representing strength or protection. A painted hand surrounded by dots and lines, symbolizing something more than flesh. These were not depictions. They were inventions, ideas given form, imagination crystallized in pigment and stone. And from this leap flowed everything that followed. Science itself begins with imagination, with the ability to picture what cannot yet be proven. Myth begins with imagination, with the ability to tell stories beyond experience. The birth of imagination was not a luxury. It was the foundation of everything human. Close your eyes and picture the moment of invention. A figure sits by the fire, a piece of ivory in hand. They carve, shaping curves, refining edges. Around them others watch, unsure at first what the form might become. Slowly a figure emerges, familiar yet unfamiliar. A gasp, a murmur. This is not something they have seen, it is something new. The moment is electric. A new world has been born in the space of a hand. Imagination is survival, stretched into possibility. To imagine danger is to prepare for it. To imagine tools not yet made is to invent them. To imagine worlds beyond the horizon is to sail toward them. Art was not merely decoration, it was practice. Each symbol, each figure, was a rehearsal for futures that did not yet exist. Perhaps every line drawn in ochre was also a question. What if? What if animals have spirits? What if the hunt can be called through image? What if the world is larger than what we see? These questions may never have been spoken, but they were asked through art, answered through imagination, and here lies the quiet genius of the Stone Age. The greatest invention of that era was not stone tools or fire, not clothing or boats. It was the ability to imagine, to create something from nothing, to shape the invisible into form. Every myth, every ritual, every tool, every city, all trace their lineage back to that first leap of imagination. Speculate further. Perhaps the true purpose of cave art was not to record, but to dream. Not to capture what was, but to conjure what might be. The painted walls were not history, they were prophecy, visions of a world both real and imagined, born in the flicker of firelight. So when we look at those ancient drawings, we are not only seeing animals and figures, we are seeing the first sparks of future science, the first seeds of myth, the first invention of the mind itself. Every drawing, every carving, every symbol was a declaration. The world is not fixed, it can be imagined, it can be remade. And in that act, humanity crossed a threshold no other species had ever passed. We became not only survivors, not only tool makers, but dreamers. The birth of imagination was the birth of humanity as we know it. If imagination was the first spark of dreaming, then burial was the first act of meaning. For in the earth, beneath layers of stone and soil, we find not only bones, but offerings, beads, tools, flowers. These were not accidents of survival. They were choices, and they tell us something profound. The dead were no longer seen as bodies alone. They were remembered as something more. Imagine the scene of one of the earliest burials. A small hollow in the ground, dug by hands worn from labor. The body laid carefully, not abandoned, but arranged. Around it red ochre scattered like blood turned to pigment. Beside it tools placed as though for journeys yet to come. Perhaps flowers, their petals now long vanished, once rested near the head. This was not disposal, this was ritual. The oldest known burials reach back more than 100,000 years, attributed to both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. In Shanidar Cave in Iraq, pollen traces suggest flowers were laid with the dead. In sites across Europe and Africa, beads and ornaments appear in graves, their presence unnecessary for survival, yet vital for meaning. These details whisper the same truth. Humans had begun to see life and death not as endings, but as continuities. Speculate for a moment. What did it mean to cover a body with earth instead of leaving it to scavengers? Was it protection, reverence, or was it the first acknowledgement of something unseen? The idea that a person was more than flesh, that something of them remained even after the body had stilled. Perhaps burial was the earliest invention of the soul. Close your eyes and picture it, a group gathered in silence, the fire flickering behind them, the night pressing close. They kneel around a body, hands moving with care. Tools are placed at the side. A bead necklace is laid across the chest. Ochre dust drifts into the air as it is sprinkled across the form. Finally, the soil is drawn over, sealing the moment. In this act, grief becomes ritual, and ritual becomes meaning. Burial also changed the memory. It created a place, specific, fixed, where the living could return. The grave became not only a marker of death, but a vessel of remembrance. To stand at it was to stand in continuity, to recall the one who lay below. In this way, burial gave structure to memory, anchoring it in the earth itself. And perhaps this was the beginning of ancestors, of lineage, of the idea that the dead still belonged to the living. Every tool buried, every bead offered, was a gift to someone who could no longer use them. The gesture itself speaks of belief, that relationships did not end with breath, that bonds stretched beyond the visible. Archaeologists debate whether Neanderthals truly practiced ritual, but the evidence lingers. Bodies placed with care, bones arranged, pigments present. Whether we call it religion or respect, it reveals symbolic thought. Death was no longer just absence, it was presence, transformed. Speculate further. What if burial was also the first story? The body lowered, the offerings placed, the words, perhaps chants, perhaps silence, shaping the moment into something remembered. Every burial was both an ending and a narrative, the first attempt to make sense of loss through ritual. And in that sense, burial was not only about the dead, it was about the living, giving them meaning in the face of absence. Think of how this invention continues. Even now, graves are marked, adorned, visited. Flowers are laid, stones placed, names spoken. The continuity stretches unbroken from the first ochre-stained burials to the cemeteries of today. To bury is to acknowledge not only mortality, but memory, and so the ritual of burial stands as one of the earliest and most profound human inventions. It was not tool, not weapon, not shelter. It was something greater, a recognition of meaning beyond survival. In the earth, the first symbols of reverence were planted, and from them the roots of belief began to grow. To place flowers with the dead, to stain the body with ochre, to lay tools by their side, these were gestures that went beyond survival. They were not acts of necessity, they were acts of belief, and in these first burials we glimpse the invention of something invisible, something that cannot be touched but has shaped all of human history, meaning itself. Consider what it implies. To bury a body with care is to acknowledge that it carries significance even after life has ended. To give gifts to the dead is to imagine that they continue in some form beyond death. These rituals were not just about grief. They were the first architecture of belief, the first scaffolding upon which the soul was built. Speculate for a moment. Perhaps the soul was humanity's earliest invention. Not a tool of wood or stone, but an idea, a recognition that life had a presence that did not end with death. The body was buried, but something else was imagined to endure. In this leap, humans created the first metaphysical technology, a way to preserve connection when the physical was gone. Close your eyes and picture it. A grave lit by torchlight, the air heavy with smoke and silence. Around it figures gather, their faces marked with pigment. One places a bead necklace on the body. Another scatters red ochre across the chest. Someone hums a low, steady tone, a sound of mourning. Each gesture carries weight. Each act transforms absence into presence, death into meaning. Burial was a language without words, a ritual that spoke to the living as much as to the dead. It gave structure to grief, turning loss into action, silence into ceremony. And in this structure lay comfort. To bury was to believe that death was not chaos, not erasure, but passage. The grave became a doorway, and through it the first stories of afterlife may have been born. Perhaps this is why beads and tools appear in graves. They were not simply tokens. They were provisions, gifts, for a journey imagined but unseen. The invention was not the object. It was the idea behind it, to imagine the dead traveling, existing, continuing. This was the dawn of belief. Archaeologists sometimes hesitate to call these practices religion. But what else can we call the impulse to honor the dead with symbols, offerings, ritual? It may not have been organized, but it was sacred. It was humanity's first attempt to make sense of the greatest mystery, death, and in doing so, they invented meaning. Speculate further. Perhaps belief itself was survival. To see death not as annihilation, but as transformation, gave hope. Hope that bonds endured, that ancestors remained, that loss was not final. This hope may have been as vital as fire, as essential as shelter, for without it, grief might paralyze. With it, life continued. Belief was not distraction, it was adaptation. And so the soul may have been the earliest of human inventions, not a thing held in the hand, but an idea carried in the mind, a way to keep the dead alive, to keep love unbroken, to give meaning to suffering. From that invention flowed all that followed: myth, ritual, religion, philosophy. The soul was the first great story, and we are still telling it. Now imagine standing at one of those ancient graves. The tools lie silent. The beads glint faintly in torchlight. The ochre stains the soil red. And yet the air is heavy with something more, a presence unseen, a belief unspoken. It is the invention of meaning echoing across millennia, whispering the same truth. Humanity was never only flesh. Humanity was also spirit. If belief gave humans spirit, tools gave them power. Long before steel, long before engines, there were stones shaped by hand, axes chipped sharp, blades napped thin, points fitted to spears. Each one was simple, each one was profound. Together they were a revolution so quiet we often forget it happened. Picture the first hand axe, a lump of flint struck with precision, its edges flaked until sharp, its form symmetrical and balanced. It fits into the palm as though designed for it, the first extension of flesh into something harder, sharper, more enduring. With it wood could be cut, meat stripped, hides scraped. What bare hands could not do, stone could. This was more than a tool, it was a multiplication of strength. From there, the toolkit expanded. Blades grew finer, scrapers more specialized. Points were fitted to wooden shafts, turning sticks into spears. With fire-hardened tips, they pierced deeper, struck truer. The bow followed, simple wood bent into arc, sinews strung tight, arrows loosed with precision. Distance was conquered. What once required proximity now required only line of sight. And then came the atlatl, the spear thrower, a lever of bone or wood that extended the arm, hurling darts farther and faster than muscle alone ever could. With it humans claimed a new scale of power. Speculate for a moment. What must it have felt like to wield such tools for the first time? To strike flint and see a blade emerge, sharper than claw, more precise than tooth. To notch an arrow and send it flying into the distance, striking prey without ever stepping close. These were not accidents. They were inventions, born of observation, practice, imagination. Each one expanded what a human body could do. Each one redrew the boundaries of survival. Close your eyes and picture a hunt before these tools. Men and women armed only with sticks and stones, chasing, struggling, vulnerable to every beast larger than themselves. Then picture it after. Spears fly, arrows strike, atlatls send projectiles deep into hides. The hunt is no longer desperation. It is strategy, precision, dominance. Invention has shifted the balance between human and animal. And yet, tools were more than weapons. They were instruments of transformation. With axes, forests could be shaped. With scrapers, hides could be prepared. With awls, holes pierced for thread. Each tool multiplied effort, carrying human intention into the material world with efficiency no bare hand could match. The toolkit was not loud, not monumental, but its impact was staggering. Archaeologists find these tools everywhere, in caves, in riverbeds, in layers of earth spanning hundreds of thousands of years. They vary in form, in refinement, but they all speak the same truth. Humans were not content to adapt. They sought to extend. Every tool was an argument against limitation, a refusal to accept weakness as fate. Speculate further. Perhaps the toolkit was humanity's first library. Each object held knowledge of stone types, of flaking techniques, of wood selection. Passed from one generation to the next, tools became lessons embodied in matter. To hold a hand axe was not only to grip stone, it was to hold memory, inheritance, skill encoded in shape. In this way, tools carried culture long before writing, and with tools came a change not just in survival, but in perception. To make a blade sharp was to see stone not as stone, but as potential. To tie point to shaft was to imagine combination, synergy. Tools taught humans to see the world not as fixed, but as malleable. Every object might be transformed, improved, repurposed. This shift in perception was as vital as the tools themselves. Think of the bow, the atlatl, the spear, all amplifications of reach, each one extending the human arm into distance. With every step, power multiplied, and with every step, the relationship between humans and their world shifted. Prey once untouchable fell. Landscapes once hostile softened. The toolkit was a revolution, not of noise, but of silence, the slow accumulation of mastery until the world itself bent under invention. Perhaps this is why tools feel so natural in our hands even now. From stone axes to smartphones, the principle is unchanged, an extension of ourselves, multiplying what we can do, what we can imagine. Each one whispers the same truth, first spoken in flint. The body is not the limit, and so the toolkit was more than survival. It was transformation. Each hand axe, each spear, each bow was a step in a quiet revolution, a revolution that turned frail bodies into dominant beings, wanderers into hunters, survivors into shapers of worlds. For every hand axe or spear point that survives in stone, there were countless inventions that did not endure. Wood rots, rope frays, resin crumbles. The earth swallows them, leaving almost no trace. And yet, these invisible tools were no less vital. They carried humanity across ages, binding survival together in ways as profound as fire or stone. Imagine, for a moment, the first rope, fibers stripped from bark, twisted together by hand, strengthened with water and dried in the sun. A cord simple and unassuming, yet capable of holding weight, binding wood, dragging burdens. It may seem humble compared to a sharpened blade, but without rope, how many inventions would falter? Spears bound to shafts, rafts tied together, hides lashed into shelter. Rope was the silent partner of every great step forward, or think of resin, sticky sap drawn from trees, hardened into glue. With it, stone points were fastened securely to wooden shafts, fractures sealed, gaps filled. It was chemistry without names, experiment without formula, but it worked, and with each drop of resin, tools grew stronger, more reliable, more enduring. The invisible became foundation. Speculate further. Perhaps some of the greatest technologies of the Stone Age left no trace at all. Woven baskets carrying berries and roots, nets stretched across rivers to catch fish, wooden sledges dragging heavy loads across plains. These may have been as important as any spear or axe, yet time has erased them. What survives in museums is only the hardest fragment of the story. The rest, the wood, the fiber, the sinew, has vanished into silence. Close your eyes and picture it. A group gathered around a fallen tree, With stone blades they strip bark into long fibers. Fingers twist them, rolling, braiding, binding. Slowly a rope takes shape. It is tested, stretched, tied. It holds. The group nods, and with that rope they drag wood for shelter, lash logs into rafts, carry meat from the hunt. Nothing of this rope will survive the centuries. But in that moment it carries life itself. These invisible technologies remind us that invention is not always monumental. Sometimes it is quiet, ephemeral, vanishing as soon as it is made. And yet their impact endures. The first basket woven from reeds may have fed generations. The first net may have turned hunger into abundance. The first cord may have bound not only wood and stone, but community itself, as people work together in shared invention. Speculate for a moment on how much we have lost. Could there have been wooden tools carved with as much precision as stone, now long gone? Could early humans have woven fabrics from plant fibers far earlier than we imagine, their patterns erased by time? Could there have been medicines brewed, resins mixed, pigments compounded, sciences as sophisticated as any later age, their traces vanished because they left no stone behind? This is the haunting truth. Much of humanity's genius may lie invisible, erased by time. What we know is only what survived, and what survived is only what was durable. But durability is not the same as importance. The invisible tools, the ropes, the baskets, the resins, the wooden handles, were as essential as stone axes, as transformative as fire. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson. Progress is not always written in monuments or megaliths. Sometimes it is braided into rope, carried in baskets, sealed with resin. Sometimes it leaves no trace but survival itself. The technology of the invisible was the hidden scaffolding of the Stone Age. It carried us across rivers, across continents, across generations. It was quiet, fragile, and vanishing. But without it, the great inventions we do remember could never have endured. For tens of thousands of years, humanity's inventions were small, portable, fragile. Rope, resin, baskets, bone flutes. But then, something astonishing happened. Around 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, on a hill in what is now southeastern Turkey, people began to raise stones so massive they rival anything built in later antiquity. This was Göbekli Tepe, a place older than cities, older than agriculture, a monument from a world that should not have been able to build it. Imagine it. Great T-shaped pillars rising from the earth, some weighing more than 20 tons, arranged in vast circular enclosures. Their surfaces carved with reliefs, foxes, lions, vultures, snakes, etched with a precision that still stuns the eye. These were not rough stones dragged together for shelter. They were deliberate, sculpted, placed with meaning. And all of this was done by hunter-gatherers, people without farms, without cities, without wheels or beasts of burden. The mystery is not only how they did it, but why. No one lived at Göbekli Tepe. There are no hearths, no houses, no signs of permanent settlement. It was not a village. It was something else, a place of gathering, of ritual, of ceremony. To carve and raise stones of such size required hundreds of hands working together. That unity was not for survival alone, it was for meaning. Speculate for a moment. What drove them to build? Was it worship of gods yet unnamed? Was it communion with ancestors, animals, spirits? Or was it something deeper, the recognition that humans could shape the world, not only to live in it, but to symbolize it? Every pillar, every carving was a statement. We are more than survival. We are meaning makers. Close your eyes and picture the scene. A line of figures moves across the plain. Ropes stretched tight across massive stones. pulling together with chance and rhythm. The sun beats down. Dust rises. Slowly, impossibly, the pillar shifts, rises, is set into its carved foundation. Cheers rise, voices echo. Then the carvers move in, chiseling patterns of animals and symbols, turning the stone into story. What had once been bedrock is now myth in solid form. Göbekli Tepe was not only a monument, it was a turning point. Some scholars suggest it may have inspired the very birth of agriculture. To gather hundreds of people for such work required food, organization, resources. Perhaps the demand to sustain these gatherings pushed people to settle, to plant, to cultivate. If true, then it was not farming that built monuments, it was monuments that built farming. The order of civilization may have begun not with grain, but with stone. The carvings themselves deepen the mystery. Animals dominate, predators, prey, birds in flight. Some seem symbolic, others mythic. Snakes coil in endless repetition. Vultures loom, foxes stride across the stone. These were not casual decorations. They were messages, stories, cosmologies we can no longer read. The pillars were not only stone. They were text, language without letters, carrying beliefs across centuries. Speculate further. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe was the world's first cathedral, not to one god, but to many, not to a doctrine, but to mystery itself. A place where tribes gathered to share rituals, to bind themselves in shared meaning, to imagine worlds larger than their own. Each stone was a page, each enclosure a chapter, together forming a book of belief written in stone. And then, almost as suddenly as it was built, Göbekli Tepe was buried. Around 8000 BCE, the site was deliberately covered with earth and stone, entombed by the very people who had raised it. Why? Was it reverence, a closing of a sacred chapter? Was it fear, a desire to hide something too powerful to leave exposed? Or was it simply the cycle of meaning itself, that once new symbols arose, the old had to be laid to rest? To stand at Göbekli Tepe today is to stand before a paradox. It should not exist, and yet it does. It rewrites our understanding of the Stone Age, reminding us that genius, imagination, and symbolic thought were not born with cities. They were already present, already burning, long before civilization. Göbekli Tepe's mystery lingers not only in its stones but in its silence. We cannot read its carvings, we cannot know its rituals, but we can feel the weight of its presence, the enormity of its meaning. It is the testament of a people who had no writing, no wheels, no farms, yet they carried genius in their hands, carving it into stone, leaving us with the question that still echoes: how much have we forgotten? Göbekli Tepe should not exist. According to the story we have long told ourselves, humans first settled into villages, then planted crops, then built cities, and only then raised monuments. But here, on a windswept hill 12,000 years ago, that order is inverted. Hunter-gatherers, people without farms or permanent homes, built a sanctuary of stone so vast it dwarfs anything their world should have allowed. It is as if civilization itself appeared centuries too early, whispering a truth we are still reluctant to face. Genius was always there. What does this mean? If Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture, then the spark of organization, collaboration, and symbolic thought was not born of farming. It existed long before. People were already capable of extraordinary acts, engineering, artistry, spiritual imagination, without the scaffolding of what we call civilization. The monument was not an outcome of progress, it was its catalyst. Speculate for a moment. What if the sequence we assume, food, village, monument, is reversed? What if the desire to build together, to create symbols in stone, drove the need for stable food sources. Perhaps it was not hunger that created ritual, but ritual that created hunger enough to cultivate. Perhaps the first temples built the first farms, not the other way around. If true, then the roots of civilization lie not in the soil of agriculture, but in the imagination of belief. Close your eyes and picture the world around Göbekli Tepe. Scattered bands of hunter-gatherers roaming the plains, following herds, foraging roots and berries. Yet when certain times came, perhaps seasons marked by stars or migration, they gathered at the hill. Tribes from far distances converged, their languages varied, their customs distinct, but united in ritual. Together they raised stones, carved animals, shared feasts. For a moment they were not scattered groups, they were a community. Civilization, not in permanence but in performance. The stones themselves testify to this unity. The carvings show creatures not confined to one region, foxes, lions, vultures, snakes, suggesting shared mythologies that transcended boundaries. Each animal may have been more than representation. Each may have been symbol, totem, spirit. The enclosures were not shelters, they were theaters of meaning. To walk among them was to step into a world shaped not by necessity, but by imagination. And then comes the haunting question: if this was possible 12,000 years ago, what else was possible that we have lost? Göbekli Tepe may not be anomaly, but remnant. How many other monuments have vanished, swallowed by time, their stones scattered, their wood rotted, their meaning erased? Could there have been other sanctuaries, other centers of gathering, their memory gone, but their legacy carried forward in myths we no longer recognize? Speculate further, perhaps the great myth of later civilizations, stories of gods descending, of golden ages before history, of temples older than cities, are faint echoes of places like Göbekli Tepe. A memory not of fantasy, but of fact, a monument from a world that should not exist, but did. This challenges our deepest assumptions. We often call the Stone Age primitive, imagining people as barely more than animals, struggling for survival, but Göbekli Tepe defies that story. It tells us that humans, long before writing or farming, carried capacities we still marvel at today: abstract thought, symbolic imagination, collective labor, architectural vision. Civilization was not a beginning, it was a continuation of genius already burning. Think of it this way: if a group of hunter-gatherers could raise Göbekli Tepe, then perhaps the boundary between prehistory and history is not as sharp as we draw it. Perhaps genius is not a product of civilization, but its foundation, always present, waiting, expressed in rope and resin, in music and myth, in stone and spirit. Civilization did not invent genius. Genius invented civilization. Now picture the burial of the site around 8000 BCE. Thousands of tons of earth deliberately piled over the stones, covering the enclosures until only a hill remained. Why bury what had taken centuries to build? Was it reverence, an intentional act of closure? Or was it necessity, the ending of an age, the sealing of knowledge too powerful to leave exposed? The silence of Göbekli Tepe may not only be mystery, it may be message. A civilization before civilization chose to erase itself. And here lies the deeper revelation. Perhaps we are not the first to stand on the threshold of invention, imagination, and meaning. Perhaps others before us, long before cities rose, glimpsed the same horizon, shaped it in stone, and then let it go. Göbekli Tepe is a reminder that what we call civilization may not be our beginning, but only our latest chapter. It is the monument that should not exist, and yet it does. proof carved in limestone that genius has always been with us, silent, enduring, waiting to be remembered. If Göbekli Tepe was genius carved into stone, then medicine was genius distilled into leaf and root. Long before physicians wrote their treatises, long before apothecaries filled shelves with jars, early humans turned to the earth for healing. They did not have laboratories, but they had forests, meadows, and rivers. They did not have formulas, but they had memory and tradition. And from this, a hidden science emerged, medicine in its earliest form. Archaeological traces give us glimpses. The Neanderthal skeleton from Shanidar Cave, more than 50,000 years old, was found with pollen from plants known to have medicinal properties: yarrow, ephedra, mallow. Coincidence or intentional healing? Many scholars believe it was no accident. Someone gathered those plants, someone placed them there, perhaps to ease pain, perhaps to honor, perhaps to heal. In that act, we see the spark of pharmacology, knowledge carried not in books, but in hands and memory. Speculate for a moment on how this knowledge began. Perhaps it started with observation. An animal eats a certain leaf and recovers. A root chewed during sickness eases pain. Bark brewed into tea lowers fever. Trial and error, watched and remembered, passed on in whispers around the fire. Over generations, these observations became tradition, a body of secret knowledge guarded by shamans, healers, wise women and men. Close your eyes and picture it. A child lies feverish, breath shallow, the tribe gathered in worry. The healer arrives carrying a bundle of dried plants. Leaves are crushed, roots ground, a bitter brew prepared. The child drinks, hours pass, the fever breaks, relief spreads. In that moment, knowledge has preserved life, and with it, the community itself. Medicine is not ornament, it is survival made precise. Nor was it limited to plants. Bones of ancient humans show signs of trepanation, holes deliberately drilled or scraped into skulls. Crude? Yes, but astonishingly, some patients survived, their bone healing after the operation. What drove such acts? Was it to release spirits believed to cause illness? Was it to relieve pressure from injury? Whatever the reason, the procedure reveals experimentation, courage, and intent. Surgery, in its rawest form, was already part of the Stone Age. Speculate further, how much knowledge has been lost? For every remedy we can trace in pollen or bone, countless others left no mark. Poultices for wounds, teas for childbirth, ointments for burns. Recipes crafted, tested, perfected, then carried in memory for generations. When a healer died, perhaps whole libraries of knowledge vanished with them, unless carefully passed on. Medicine was fragile, living only in the breath of those who knew, but it was also sacred. Healing was not only physical, it was ritual. Chants sung over wounds, smoke wafted from burning herbs, beads pressed into palms. To heal was to connect body and spirit, to weave survival with meaning. The line between science and magic was not drawn. Both worked together, each amplifying the other. Think of it this way. The first physicians were not separate from shamans. They were one and the same. Knowledge of plants was inseparable from knowledge of myth, of spirit, of ritual. To brew a potion was to heal both body and soul. This integration was not weakness, it was strength. It ensured that healing was holistic, that no aspect of human suffering was left unaddressed. And so, in the shadow of monuments and the silence of caves, another revolution unfolded, not in stone, but in leaf, not in bone, but in bark. A revolution of hidden science, of experiments conducted by necessity, of cures passed in secret traditions. The evidence is fragmentary, but the truth is clear. Medicine was already ancient by the time cities rose. It was the quiet knowledge that kept tribes alive through fever, wound, and childbirth. It was not written down, yet it endured, and in every sip of bitter tea, in every wound bound with herbs, humanity learned that the earth itself could be shaped not only for tools and shelter, but for healing. For every leaf brewed into tea, for every wound closed with resin, for every fever soothed by bark, there must have been thousands of remedies now vanished. The tragedy of early medicine is not that it did not exist. It is that so much of it was lost. The Stone Age may have held entire sciences, whispered from healer to apprentice, that disappeared when memory broke, when traditions ended, when silence swallowed knowledge. Speculate for a moment how many discoveries were made and forgotten, which roots could numb pain, which leaves stopped bleeding, which mushrooms sharpened vision, and which ones poisoned. Trial and error carved knowledge at a cost, each mistake etched into memory with lives. Over generations these experiments formed a body of wisdom as vast as any library, yet one never written down, carried only in voices, in ritual, in practice. Imagine a healer's kit 20,000 years ago, a pouch of dried herbs, a stone mortar stained with pigment from crushed roots, a flask of water infused with bark, resin hardened in shells, tools for trepanation, stone scrapers, bone awls, obsidian flakes sharper than steel. Each item bore meaning, each was a vessel of knowledge. To us they might look like curiosities, to them they were lifelines. Close your eyes and picture a scene. A woman in labor, her cries echoing through the shelter. The healer burns sage, filling the air with smoke meant to calm spirits. A tea is brewed from leaves known to ease pain, pressed into her hands. As contractions intensify, chants begin, rhythms steady, voices low. Hours pass, then a cry. The child is born. Was it the herbs, the chants, the smoke, perhaps all at once? Medicine was never separate from ritual. It was holistic, addressing body, spirit, and meaning in the same breath. The line between healing and belief was thin, but that does not mean it was empty. Modern science has confirmed what ancient people must have known. Willow bark eases pain, honey heals wounds, certain clays fight infection. What else did they know that we have forgotten? Could they have identified plants we still overlook? Could they have combined remedies in ways we have never rediscovered? The possibility is haunting. Speculate further. Entire branches of Stone Age science may have vanished. Knowledge of fermentation, turning plants into brews with altered properties, knowledge of poisons, crafted for hunting, but perhaps also for medicine in tiny doses, knowledge of anesthetics, roots and herbs that dulled pain, used in crude surgeries like trepanation. The evidence is faint, but the logic is clear. To survive, humans had to experiment, to refine, to remember. That knowledge, if fully preserved, might rival discoveries made millennia later. But fragility was its curse. Unlike stone tools or carved bones, plants rot, recipes vanish, rituals dissolve. When a healer died without passing on their wisdom, centuries of knowledge could vanish in an instant. Whole traditions may have been erased in moments of silence. What we see as primitive may be only the shadow of what was once a flourishing science of healing, and yet echoes remain. Indigenous knowledge today preserves fragments of this ancient science. Remedies passed through oral tradition often prove effective when tested in laboratories. A bark that lowers fever, a root that stops infection, a seed that calms the mind. These are not accidents, they are survivals, the last living threads of a vast Stone Age web of discovery. Perhaps the most haunting truth is this: the Stone Age may have known medicines we cannot rediscover, plants extinct, recipes forgotten, practices erased. There may have been cures carried in memory that could have saved millions if only they had endured. The hidden science of the Stone Age is not only mystery, it is loss, and so, when we imagine our ancestors, we must see more than hunters and gatherers. We must see experimenters, healers, scientists of another kind. They had no books, but they had traditions. They had no laboratories, but they had forests and fields. Their science was hidden not because it was absent, but because time has erased its traces. The earliest invention may not have been the spear, nor the axe, nor even fire. It may have been the act of discovery itself, the human impulse to test, to remember, to heal. A technology of knowledge, invisible yet enduring, erased yet echoing still. If discovery was the first science, then language was the first technology of the mind. Fire reshaped our bodies. Tools extended our reach. Medicine eased our suffering. But language bound us together in ways no invention of stone or bone could. It was the unseen thread that stitched individuals into tribes, tribes into cultures, cultures into humanity. Consider what it meant before words. Communication was gesture, glance, grunt. A pointed finger might warn of danger. A shout might rally hunters. A look might soothe a child. Effective, yes, but limited. Then slowly sounds became symbols. A bark meant wolf. A cry meant water. Over generations, the lexicon grew. Sounds became words. Words became sentences. Sentences became stories. Suddenly humans were not only reacting to the present. They were planning futures, recalling pasts, imagining worlds. Speculate for a moment. Perhaps the first true word was not a noun but a verb, not tree but come, not fire but give, action before object, connection before classification. Language was not only about naming things, it was about binding people. Every utterance was an invitation to act together, to think together, to imagine together. Close your eyes and picture a hunt before language. Movements uncoordinated, signals unclear, prey slipping away. Now picture it after. A leader whispers instructions. Hunters move in silence, each knowing their role. A word signals the strike. The prey falls. Success is no longer chance, it is coordination. Language has turned individuals into strategy, but language did more than organize. It preserved. Stories of migrations, of hunts, of ancestors could now be retold, passed from mouth to ear across generations. Myths stretched memory further than any single life. Knowledge traveled not only in objects, but in words, and words were lighter than stone, more enduring than bone. Speculate further. Could language itself have shaped the brain? The need to remember long chains of sounds, to link symbols with meaning, to imagine stories not yet lived, this may have rewired cognition, expanding memory, imagination, empathy. With language, humans could step into another's mind, feel another's fear, share another's joy. The tribe was no longer just bodies gathered. It was thoughts interwoven, and from this web of thought came culture, songs that carried myths, ritual chants that preserved order, names that anchored identity, promises spoken, pacts made, truths declared. Language was not only tool, it was power. To speak was to shape reality, to give form to the invisible, to make the imagined tangible. Think of the first lullabies, the first chants, the first speeches by firelight. Each was more than sound, it was spell. A lullaby soothed because it wrapped comfort in rhythm and word. A chant bound a group because it synchronized breath and belief. A speech inspired because it gave shape to what others could only feel. Words were magic before they were grammar. Archaeologists cannot unearth these words. They leave no trace, no fossil, no artifact, but their impact is carved into everything that followed. Without language, no myth would endure, no instruction would carry, no culture would hold. It was language that allowed cooperation on scales unimaginable, that turned wandering bands into communities, that made possible the great works of art, architecture, and ritual yet to come. Speculate one last time. What if language was humanity's true beginning, the invention that allowed all others to flourish? Fire gave us warmth, tools gave us strength, medicine gave us life, but language gave us humanity. It was the voice of memory, the breath of imagination, the echo of spirit, and in it, for the first time, thought itself became shareable. Language was not just invention, it was transformation. The moment sounds became symbols. Humanity ceased to be solitary. We became a chorus, speaking, remembering, dreaming. The world was no longer only what one saw, but what many could describe together. In that chorus, civilization itself had already begun. Once words existed, they did not remain bound to the present. They reached backward and forward, gathering memory, shaping expectation. Out of language grew something greater, story. And story was more than entertainment. It was invention, a technology to preserve knowledge, encode memory, and transmit wisdom across time. Imagine a firelit night on the edge of the Ice Age. Children huddle close, the cold pressing against the cave mouth. An elder begins to speak. The voice rises and falls with rhythm, with drama. Hands gesture, faces glow. A tale unfolds of a great hunt, of a storm, survived, of ancestors who walked before. For the children, the story is more than words. It is instruction, where the herds move, which plants to avoid, how to honor the dead. Wrapped in myth, the code of survival is passed on. Speculate for a moment. Perhaps the first true invention of the mind was not the spear, not the hut, not even fire. Perhaps it was narrative, the ability to bind facts and meaning into a structure that could endure. Stories are portable. They live in memory, travel in speech, survive in song. They outlast the individual, carrying knowledge into futures the teller will never see. Close your eyes and picture the earliest myths, a constellation named in song, teaching when to plant or when to hunt, an animal transformed into spirit, warning of dangers or blessing of abundance, a hero remembered, embodying courage, loyalty, cunning. Each story encoded something vital. Each was a library without walls, an archive without stone, and in myth, truth and imagination intertwined. A tale of a great flood might recall an actual deluge, retold until it became legend. A tale of a spirit animal might preserve practical lessons about migration, behavior, or danger. The boundary between fact and fable did not weaken the story. It strengthened it, embedding knowledge in form that memory could not forget. Speculate further. Perhaps every great myth of later civilizations, of gods and heroes, of floods and fires, of origins and endings, was rooted in this Stone Age code. Not inventions of cities, but inheritances of caves. The code of the ancestors was not written on tablets of clay or parchment of further vellum. It was written in voices, in rhythm, in imagination. This code was more than memory, it was glue. Shared stories bound tribes together, creating identity larger than any one life. To know the same myth was to belong. To repeat the same tale was to join a lineage. Stories became borders of the invisible world, defining who was us and who was other. In this way, myth was not only knowledge, it was law, morality, and map. Picture a child listening wide-eyed to a tale of a hunter who defied spirits and failed. The message is clear. respect the forces of the world, follow the tribe's rules, honor the ancestors. The story is not just lesson, it is technology, a way of encoding social order into memory, ensuring survival not through punishment alone, but through belief. And yet, stories did more than instruct. They inspired. They gave meaning to suffering, hope to loss, courage to fear. In them, humans found ways to endure the unendurable, to imagine that death was not the end, that hardship carried purpose, that life was part of something larger. The code of the ancestors was not only practical, it was spiritual. Perhaps this is why stories endure with such power even now. We still tell myths of beginnings, of heroes, of endings. We still encode our truths in narratives, wrapping knowledge in drama so that it survives. Though medium has changed, stone to ink, ink to screen, but the function is the same. Stories are how we remember, how we believe, how we endure. The code of the ancestors was humanity's first scripture, its first archive, its first science of continuity. Myths were not illusions, they were technologies of memory, each one a vessel carrying knowledge across generations, ensuring that no invention, no lesson, no truth was ever entirely lost. And in that, they were as essential as fire, as transformative as tools, as enduring as stone. The code of the ancestors was not carved on tablets or etched into stone. It lived in the air, in the cadence of voices, in the memory of those who listened. It was intangible, fragile, always at risk of vanishing. And yet, paradoxically, it proved more enduring than monuments. For when stones fell, when cities crumbled, the stories endured. Picture the scene. A cold night, the wind pressing hard at the mouth of the cave. Inside, fire burns low. The hunters have returned, their spears stacked, their bodies weary. The children huddle near the flames. Then the elder begins. At first, silence fills the chamber, the crack of the fire the only sound. Then words, slow, measured, ancient. A tale unfolds of a hero who sought the great stag, who crossed rivers of ice, who listened to the spirits of the sky. Every child leans forward, eyes wide. The story is not just entertainment, it is instruction. It encodes paths through forests, rivers to avoid, seasons to heed. Wrapped in myth, survival becomes memory. This was the genius of story. It combined the practical with the sacred, embedding knowledge so deeply in the mind that it could not be forgotten. To forget a hunting path might mean death. To forget a chant might mean angering spirits. To forget a ritual might mean losing the tribe's identity. Story was the safeguard, the encryption of wisdom in form that memory loved to carry. Speculate for a moment. Perhaps myths of creation were not about explaining the universe in abstraction, but about orienting people in the world around them. In the beginning, the river came from the mountain is not cosmology. It is geography remembered. The sun was born of fire and returns each day to the cave of night is not theology. It is a lesson in cycles, in predictability, in the rhythm of time. Myth was a manual disguised as wonder. Close your eyes and imagine the rhythm of those stories, not monotone, but full of gesture, chant, song. A spoken myth was not just heard, it was performed. The body moved, the voice rose, the firelight painted shadows on the walls. Each telling was an act of theater, etching images in the minds of listeners. In this way, myth was as visual as cave painting, as resonant as music. It engaged memory not through logic alone, but through awe, and awe, perhaps, was the true genius. Because awe makes memory unforgettable. A child may not remember a list of instructions, but they will remember the story of the hunter who angered the spirits and was swallowed by the mountain. A tribe may not recall the precise count of moons in a season, but they will remember the tale of the star that rises with the return of the herds. In this way, myth became a machine of retention, ensuring that knowledge did not fade. Speculate further. What if every myth we tell today, of gods, of heroes, of endings and beginnings, is a fossil of this first technology? The flood myths found from Mesopotamia to the Americas, were they not perhaps memories of Ice Age deluges retold for millennia? The hero's journey, appearing in cultures across the globe, was it not perhaps born of the universal act of the hunt, transfigured into narrative? The dragon or serpent, present in every mythology, was it not perhaps a fossil of encounters with snakes, magnified by fear into archetype? The code of the ancestors may have been the true library of prehistory, not one we can read with eyes, but one we can feel in echoes. The epics of Homer, the Vedas of India, the sagas of the Norse, each may be the late flowering of seeds planted in caves tens of thousands of years earlier, when stories first became the vessels of human continuity. But the code did not only preserve knowledge, it created identity. Shared myth defined who belonged. To know the same stories was to be part of the same lineage. To forget them was to fall outside. Stories were borders of belonging, invisible yet powerful, more binding than walls of stone. They told not only how to live, but who we were. Now picture a burial. The body is laid in earth, tools at its side. Around it words are spoken, not merely laments but stories. The deceased is remembered as hunter, mother, singer. The story is told not only to honor, but to preserve. The dead are woven into the code. They do not vanish. They become characters in the eternal narrative of the tribe. In this way, myth is not only memory, it is immortality. Perhaps this was the first immortality humans ever knew, not the survival of the body, not the promise of a soul, but the endurance of story. To be remembered was to live again each time your name was spoken, each time your tale was retold. The code of the ancestors was not only practical, it was transcendent. And here lies the paradox. Myths were inventions, yet they were truer than facts. A fact lasts until it changes. A myth lasts as long as it is believed. Myths were not mirrors of the world. They were blueprints, shaping the way people saw, acted, believed. In this sense, myth was not memory of the past, but technology of the future. From this code would spring all that followed: epics, scriptures, philosophies, histories. But at its core, it was still what it had always been: the first human invention of continuity, the bridge between generations. The code of the ancestors was not illusion. It was the deepest truth we ever made. It preserved the past, shaped the present, and dreamed the future. It was, in its way, the oldest invention still alive within us. We often imagine civilization as stone rising into the sky, temples, walls, pyramids, cities sprawling across valleys. But long before the first brick was laid, there were civilizations of another kind, ones that left no ruins for us to uncover. They did not build with stone, they built with thought. Every invention, fire, clothing, shelter, rope, medicine, story, was born before cities. Each was crafted not in palaces, but in camps, not in empires, but in tribes. We look for monuments to measure progress, but perhaps that is our mistake. Progress did not require stone, it required imagination, and imagination was already abundant. Picture a band of hunters moving silently across a plain. Each knows their role. One flushes prey, another circles wide, another waits in ambush. Their coordination is not instinct, it is knowledge, refined through countless hunts, passed through words, stories, gestures. In that cooperation lies a civilization, not of walls but of minds. Speculate for a moment. Perhaps every tribe was its own university. Within each, knowledge of plants, of animals, of stars, of paths was preserved and passed on. They may not have written, but they taught. They may not have drawn maps, but they remembered landscapes in song and story. They may not have inscribed laws, but they enforced them in ritual and myth. By these measures, every tribe was already a civilization, one whose monuments were invisible, but whose genius was undeniable. Close your eyes and imagine the knowledge carried by a single elder. Which plants heal, which waters are safe, which paths lead to shelter, which stars mark the seasons' change. That mind is a library, that voice is an archive. When the elder speaks, it is civilization speaking, not of cities, but of survival, of continuity, of meaning. Archaeology shows us stone tools, bones, fire pits, but it cannot show us the rest, the invisible architectures of thought that guided every action. Where to hunt when herds vanished, how to weave fibers into rope, how to prepare poisons for arrows, how to preserve meat through smoke. These were not chance discoveries. They were systems of knowledge, organized, taught, remembered. Speculate further. How many such civilizations of thought have vanished without trace, tribes who mastered medicines we cannot rediscover, groups who mapped stars with precision lost to time, peoples who developed myths so rich they carried entire cosmologies, but whose voices are now silent. Their genius did not die with them, it carried forward in fragments, absorbed into the larger human story, but the fullness of it, the wholeness of their civilizations, is gone. Perhaps this is why we undervalue them. Because they left no monuments, we call them primitive. But what if the absence of stone is not absence of genius? What if their true monuments were minds, ephemeral, fragile, and yet more flexible than any pyramid? Think of the Inuit navigating frozen seas with memory alone. No compass, no map. Think of the Polynesians reading waves and stars to cross thousands of miles of open ocean. Think of the sand people of Africa, who can track animals across vast plains by the faintest trace. These are not relics of savagery. They are civilizations of thought, complex, refined, invisible. The Stone Age was filled with such civilizations, each tribe a laboratory of survival, each group a library of knowledge. Progress was not always measured in monuments. Sometimes it was carried in silence, in memory, in the unbroken chain of teaching from one generation to the next. And perhaps the most haunting truth is this: we will never know how much has been lost. For every invention we uncover, countless others may have existed in the minds of those who left no trace. Rope that rotted, words that faded, songs that fell silent, civilizations without cities, carrying genius in silence, progress without monuments. They remind us of a truth deeper than any ruin can teach. Civilization is not defined by stone. It is defined by thought. And by that measure, humanity has been civilized far longer than we admit. The story of the Stone Age is often told as one of waiting, as if humanity sat in darkness until the light of civilization finally arrived. But the truth is far different. The Stone Age was not an age of ignorance. It was an age of hidden genius. Fire was mastered and shaped into the first machine. Boats crossed seas long before compasses. Clothing, needles, and rope carried us into impossible climates. Medicine soothed wounds with roots and bark. Music gave us memory. Art gave us imagination. Stories gave us meaning. Burial gave us the soul. Every great invention we claim as the birthright of civilization had its seed in prehistory. The spark was already there, burning in the minds of people who had no cities, no writing, no temples. Their monuments were not always of stone. Some were of fiber, ash, resin, and memory, fragile, invisible, yet more enduring than walls. And while many of these inventions are now gone, erased by time, their echoes remain in us still. Speculate for a moment. How much have we lost? Could there have been machines of wood and rope we will never know? Medicines that could have saved lives vanished with the death of a healer. Stories that encoded entire cosmologies, silenced forever when the last teller's voice faded. We will never know the full measure of their genius. What survives are fragments, and yet even those fragments are enough to remind us that the Stone Age was not a beginning of ignorance, but the continuation of brilliance. The central question lingers. What else did our ancestors invent that time has erased? How much of our story lies buried in soil, dissolved in rivers, carried away on the wind? And what does it mean to realize that civilization is not our origin, but our inheritance, an inheritance built by countless forgotten engineers, healers, and storytellers who carried us through the dark? Picture it, a cave, fire burning low, shadows shifting across rough stone. A figure lifts a flute carved from bone, places it to their lips. The sound rises, thin, haunting, trembling. It drifts through the cavern, echoing off the walls, carrying beyond the moment, beyond the life of the player, beyond even the age itself. That sound crosses millennia. We can still hear it today if we listen closely. The flute sings, and in its song is the truth. Genius was always there,